What is our one desire in our heart? Is that to follow Christ, to live a holy life? Then we have a really good desire. But if it is, the desire is to please the world, then it doesn't look very good for us. But yeah, let's have that in our prayer. Purified my heart, God. That should be our daily prayer. And I'm happy to announce we are having a guest speaker this Sunday, and it is Abe Janzen. Would you please come up here? And he will serve us with the Word of God, and may the Lord bless you and give you strength, and that we can be encouraged through that. And yeah, then we will give the pulpit over to you. God bless.
Thank you very much for inviting me to Picture Butte EMC. I want to introduce Kathy and Joan. Kathy is my wife. They're sitting over there. Kathy and I have been here before, and I've been here more than once. So I'm glad to come back to Picture Butte. Kathy and I are both Mennonite, actually Plotich, maybe not quite as Plotich as you are, but I can try. I was born in Saskatchewan, but so is Kathy. She is from the Swiss Mennonite. Dat zijn de andere Mennoniten, nee? We naden de Emma de Engelsche as we grew up. But she's from the Swiss Mennonites. They came to North America long before we did. We came in the 1870s, right? That's quite recent. They came already in the 1688, right? They moved from Switzerland to Pennsylvania, and then when there was a war between Canada and the United States, of which I know almost nothing, but then they moved to Ontario, where a lot of you have relatives, and the Swiss Mennonites settled in Ontario before we got there, because we came much later. And then her ancestors, her grandfather, moved to Saskatchewan, I think 1905. And so in Saskatchewan, there's, as far as I know, only one Swiss Mennonite settlement, but there are quite a few in Alberta. Dutchess has one, Blue Sky has one, Salem near Tofield has one. You know all those places. So the Swiss Mennonites are here among us, and we are among them. And Kathy and I met, if you can believe this, in Bolivia. Most of you met somewhere else too, right? And so did we. We were there with MCC many years ago, met there, and then lived in La Crete for a while, and eventually ended up in Calgary, where we now live, and I work with the Canadian Food Grains Bank there now. And I want to mention one other thing. We are members of Abbeydale Christian Fellowship. That's the EMC church in Calgary. Some of you may have been there at some point. Anyway, Abbeydale, it's the name of the church. We are celebrating our 50th anniversary on September 22nd in the morning. So if you want to do something else on September the 22nd at 10:30, their big celebration starts, and I'm sure they would welcome anybody who wants to join them in celebrating 50 years. That's not very long. It's a young world here in Alberta. All those comments by way of introduction. I asked Craig, when he invited me to speak, if I could say some things about the Canadian Food Grains Bank, because I work with the Canadian Food Grains Bank. I'm an old man, but I have a temporary assignment with the Food Grains Bank because the Alberta rep got sick about almost a year ago, and they asked if I would do it for a while, and I said yes, and so here you have me working for the Canadian Food Grains Bank. So I want to show you 15 slides. You are on some of those slides before we start. Does that show up, Corny? There it is. Thank you. But before I do that, I actually want to read the scripture that we have for this morning, because it all has to do with the ministry of Jesus, who is God himself among us. So Mark chapter 6. Well, first of all, Psalm 4:6. It's a verse that we all think sometimes, and it's just one verse, but it says, "There are many who say, 'Oh, that we might see some good.'" Do we ever think that? We wake up in the morning or go to bed in the evening and we think, "Oh, that we might see some good." Because the world can be a little bit depressing for us, right? Sometimes it's very depressing and it's very hard to see good around us, and we have to use our imaginations a little bit, but it's there. So the psalmist feels that same despair sometimes. And then there's kind of a response in the New Testament, and it's in Mark. It's Jesus. Jesus is the response to all our despair, isn't he? So it reads like this. It's Mark chapter 6, which if you don't have time, go home and read the whole chapter. It's a very interesting chapter. It's where John the Baptist gets beheaded. It's where Jesus walks on the water. It's where Jesus feeds 5,000 people, all in one chapter. It is a very busy chapter. But I'll read only two little parts of it. The first is verse 30 to 34. The apostles gathered around Jesus, reported to him all they had done and taught. And then, because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, this is the disciples, he said to them, "Come with me, buy yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." Jesus thought of us. We all need rest. So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place, but many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns. And they didn't even have cell phones to send messages, just figured it out, right? From all the towns around, and got there ahead of them. And when Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And so he began teaching them many things. And then the feeding of the 5,000, as it's called, happens right after this in that same chapter. But then, once that is done and Jesus has walked on the water, we won't read that. Then in verse 53, they try again to get some rest. And when they had crossed over, they had just survived the storm on the water. When they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret and anchored there. And as soon as they got out of the boat, people recognized Jesus. They ran throughout that whole region and carried the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, into villages, towns, or countryside, they placed the sick in the marketplaces. They begged him to let them touch even the edge of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. Those people were desperate. They were looking for hope, just as we are in this century, still looking for that same hope. So I want to talk about our search for hope. And part of that is the Canadian Food Grains Bank. It is the mission work that you people do in other missions through the EMC and maybe others that you support. That is the kind of hope that we're trying to bring to the world. So just a few slides. The Canadian Food Grains Bank started in 1983. It's a young organization started by some farmers. The next slide, it's based actually on Matthew 25, we should feed the hungry. Started in the 70s, actually, with some farmers in the Canadian prairies who were bagging wheat. They took compassion on people in Bangladesh and Ethiopia, where in Bangladesh, in that year, 1.5 million people died of starvation. So the Canadian government thought, we'll help those Canadian farmers, and they started to match that grain. They were actually shipping grain in bags. That's a lot of work. Shipping grain, bagging it, and then getting it to a place where people are already dying of hunger. So they were hopeful. They were people of faith. I would have said, "Dot yet feel too long, we'll never get it there." They did it anyway. The government began to help, and then MCC, with whom you're also familiar, became the home of what was then called the MCC Food Grains Bank. And in 1983, the Canadian government said, why don't other churches become part of this? Because they wanted to. And so within 5 years, 15 churches became members of the Canadian Food Grains Bank. So now I'll show you those churches. 15 churches, go to the next one, and there they all are. And I won't point them all out to you. I think I've shown this slide here before, but on the top left, Seventh-day Adventists, the Christian Alliance, the Baptists on the right, the Lutherans, down from the Lutherans, the Pentecostals, the Mennonites, the Nazarenes, I won't name them all, Salvation Army, World Renew, that's the one you might be the most familiar with, because the Christian Reformed people are all around here. And they're one of the biggest partners or members of the Canadian Food Grains Bank. So 15 different church missions are now what makes the Canadian Food Grains Bank. Next. That is our mission. Next. And that is just a little story of the last season, 2023-24, the places in the world where the Food Grains Bank has been working. 35 countries, Africa, where the most hunger is, the Americas, which means mostly South America and Haiti, Asia, the Middle East. Syria, that war that started in 2011, is still, after all these years, the single biggest problem in the world when it comes to hunger. 14 million, that country only had 26 million people when that war broke out. 14 million of those people have been displaced. That's almost half the population. Imagine if half the population of Canada or even of Alberta had to be displaced. What would happen to our economy? What would happen to all of us? It would be very difficult, and they still are now the single biggest problem for the Canadian Food Grains Bank and for the international world. Next. That's just a map. I left some brochures in the back there on a table, and that is a placemat. If you want a placemat for your dinner table, you can pick one of those up. It shows where all over the world the Food Grains Bank is working. Next. And this is, again, some of the bigger humanitarian crises around the world that are happening right now. You can see the countries there. I can hardly read it from here, but it's Africa at the top, Asia and the Middle East, and then the Americas. Most of those, if you look at them, are caused because of because of violence. Hunger because of violence. War creates trouble for everything. It never solves anything, it seems. Some of it is also in East Africa because of drought. Many years of drought in a row. We know a little bit about that in Alberta when we have 4 or 5 years of not enough rain. Last spring, we all thought we wouldn't have any crop. Some farmers even thought maybe we wouldn't even plant a crop because it was so dry. They know all about that in East Africa. Next. This is just a family. It's just one little story of what happens when there is violence. So this is 2 families in Congo where there has been war already for decades, and it's so far away and it's so over there somewhere that the world hardly pays attention to it. Also because it's a very poor country, and so we kind of forget about Congo, but millions of people have been slaughtered there by the neighbors, by guerrillas from other countries coming in. And this is Congo. And so this woman on the left, her name is Sarah, she and her husband were caught in this violence, and they ran for several days to another community called Sasha. I don't know where it is, and they found a displacement camp there. In the world today, there are about 80 million people who are displaced. A displaced person is someone who has been pushed out of their home and their village and are somewhere else in the same country, but not in their own home. So that's what happened there. And so they went to this displacement camp that sometimes governments or the United Nations will set up. And they stayed there for a while, and then for some reason or other, that camp was closed. And so what did they do then? She and her husband and several children. So a family, also poor, in that same village, took them in. And that man's name is Ben. He's the one standing in the middle there. But he already has 9 children and a wife to support. So they took in this other family, and they shared their garden space with them. And so far as I know, they are still there, putting up with each other and living together. And that happens a lot in a lot of countries. Lebanon, a place where there's so much violence these days, took in so many Syrian refugees starting in 2011, and many of those are not in refugee camps. They're actually living with other people who took them in. That's now how many years later? 14 years later, and they're still living like that in many cases. The Food Grains Bank tries to distribute food to make it a little bit easier for the host families to help the people who have come to move in with them. Next. And this is Alberta. So how does the Food Grains Bank work? You people make it work. So this is actually a field in Medicine Hat where I was a week and a half ago. They had the second, I think, harvest in Alberta there, 27 bushels per acre on wheat. 2 combines. It took them about an hour and a half, and they took off their 70 acres. Next. Same field, 2 combines. Next. And this is Vauxhall. They have a bigger harvest there. They had 18 combines together, and they took the crop off. It still took them a while because it was a heavy crop. It still took them about an hour and a half to take off 155 acres, I think, of barley, 165 bushels per acre. That's a good crop. So what happens is these crops get sold to the elevator the same day, and that money gets turned into cash, and it goes to the countries where the food is being consumed, where it's needed. It's the Canadian government that makes all that happen. You people donate, other people donate, farmers sell grain that is then donated, and that goes then to the Food Grains Bank, and then from there it's distributed to those 15 church missions that do the work overseas. Next. And this is your field right here. That's Tony Cox. Some of you will know him. He has an office downtown here, and it's just, if you go to, I think, to the first corner, and then you turn, some of you have seen the field, and then you turn right, there's a sign that says Picture Butte Food Grains Bank, and then there's an arrow that points that way. And he told me, this was taken 2 weeks ago, it's a little riper now, but he said they will have the harvest on September the 5th at 11 o'clock in the morning. They're going to have a barbecue there. Hopefully it doesn't rain, in which case it's postponed, but everyone is invited. That is your 160 acres of barley. It looks like a very good crop. Next. And this is you, many of you at least, playing bingo last spring. I forget now the date. I was there and took some pictures playing turkey bingo here at the Iron Springs School, and you raised money for the school and also for the Food Grains Bank. So thank you for doing that. As I said at the beginning, the Food Grains Bank works in many different ways, and whatever people can and are willing to do to make it happen, to help people in another part of the world, that is what we want to encourage. One last picture, I think, after this. More bingo. Next. And I think that's it, right? Thank you. So now I want to talk a little bit more about our search of hope. All these people that benefit by the work of missions like the Food Grains Bank are people in search of hope, but so are we. So there are many who say, "Oh, that we might see some good. Lift up the light of your countenance upon us, O Lord," the psalmist says. And we humans are those people. We are people of hope. It sets us apart from animals, I'm quite sure. Human beings hope, even when, as the psalmist says, we find little that makes us hopeful. But like the psalmist, how do we see the good that we all long to see? Where do we find the hope we sometimes think is so hard to find? There are times for all of us when it feels like God himself comes down and gives us some extra hope, some new energy. I bet most of you have some story of where you felt God suddenly came in a strange way, in a surprising way to you. Acts chapter 2 is one such amazing story in the Bible where the disciples and others were waiting in the upper room, and then suddenly the Holy Spirit came down on them and they spoke in tongues, and flames of fire came on their heads. Why did that happen? Because they were afraid, because they were frustrated, and they were confused. And sometimes when we are in those moments in our lives, God actually steps into our lives in a more direct way than he usually does. And I think that's what happened there. Those people really needed to feel and see some evidence that God was actually there for them. And that's what happened. Most of the time, however, hope comes in less direct ways to us. It comes from each other. And if you read Acts chapter 2 to the very end of the chapter, it says, and every day many people were added to their group. Why was that? Not because they saw tongues of fire coming down on them. It was because those people were taking care of each other. The Bible is very clear. Those people decided no one would suffer. They would look after each other's needs, and they did. And then it says, and the other people saw that. And every day, more people were added to their group. And that's what happens when we bring hope to the world around us. People want that same hope. I find it tremendously hopeful, for instance, when I see someone, anyone, go out of their way to help someone. Even the smallest thing makes a difference. A polite person in a restaurant who leaves a generous tip, a young man who holds the door for an older person or for any person, a father who takes a little extra time for his young child before he dashes out the door to get to work on time, a husband who speaks gently to his wife and children even when he's late getting out the door, a business person who is polite to their staff. These are, for me at least, the things that matter, the things that change a person's day for the better every time, and they are so easy. They are not hard. Every little action like these makes someone else more hopeful. Sometimes hope, however, is a little less obvious, but it is there if we look for it. On Monday this past week, I was in a combine just north of Foremost. A young man driving the combine, one of 11 machines on that field, was born in Paraguay. Some of you probably know him. Now he lives here in southern Alberta with his wife and 3 children. His parents moved back and forth several times, he said, and he has also, and even now he is thinking he might move again. But this moving is a little bit in our Low German blood, isn't it? We migrate. We have a long history of moving and starting over. How many of you were born in Alberta? Not many? There are a few. How many were born in Alberta? There are already a few, right? But most of us, we come, or our parents at least, come from somewhere else. We've all moved probably more than once, probably several times. That is kind of our history. It began in the 1500s in Central Europe when we were persecuted and we moved to what was then Prussia, the Danzig area, and is now Poland. Prussia became difficult because they wanted Mennonite boys in their army, and also they thought Mennonites were taking up too much land. That's what people now say about Mennonites in Bolivia. Oh, they're taking up so much land, and so it becomes a little uncomfortable for the Mennonites sometimes in some parts of Bolivia. So Mennonites in Prussia looked for a more hopeful land and moved to what is today Ukraine. We came then to Manitoba from southern Russia in the 1870s, but only 40 years later, some of us already moved to Mexico and Paraguay, in the 1920s. You know some of that story. That was a school question, but it also had to do with war. We were German people, and we were at war with Germany, and then suddenly Mennonites were not that welcome in Canada anymore, even though we had been very welcome. So the government tightened some of their rules about Mennonites in schools, and what did we do? We moved to Mexico and Paraguay. That was only about 40 years ago, and some began to move back to Canada, first to Ontario and soon also to Alberta, now only about 40 years ago. Those who stayed in Mexico and Paraguay, those early ones that left in the 1920s, are now hundreds of thousands. There are close to 300 colonies in South America, and they are spread, and maybe I'm missing a country, Belize, Argentina, Bolivia, Peru, Colombia, and some recently to Angola in Africa. Not many, but I think there are some there. There are many reasons why Mennonites migrate. Some would say it's just who we are. Some would say we are just Orich. One person, when I visited with him earlier this week, said it's because we have never found a homeland after leaving Germany and Holland back in the 1500s. We feilen uns noch nicht ganz tschüss. And we're still looking for that. Maybe there's something to that. But I think we are also a people of hope. We move and then we invest, and most always we make the places where we settle a little bit better. Most of the places we have settled have not been easy. My uncle in Bolivia sold his farm in one colony when he was 71 years old and started over in a new colony. I'm sure that was very hard on him and on his wife, and I have never heard of one Mennonite who said that was an easy move. It's always hard, and people always suffer. But to keep doing this and investing again and again, you can't do that unless you know something about hope. We may look like we are restless and orich, but it's hope, I think, that keeps us motivated. We do like to be left alone, but whether we like it or not, Low German Mennonites often bring hope to the people among whom we settle. Our friend in Bolivia, who's lived there for a long time, who is not a Mennonite, said recently, the Bolivian neighbors are glad the Mennonites are here, no matter what some people say. Mennonites create economy, they create jobs. We need them, the neighbors say. A Mexican person once told me the same thing about northern Mexico, and here in southern Alberta, now that I drive around a lot, I hear similar things. A feedlot farmer near Vauxhall, also not a Mennonite, recently told me if the Mennonites left, we might as well shut down the farm and most of the southern Alberta economy. I'm not saying any of this so that we can be proud, but Mennonites are good at figuring out a lot of things and making them work, and that helps the people around us also. It always does, and all this creates opportunities for work, and it creates hope in our neighbors. Hope is what keeps us alive, keeps us getting up in the mornings, looking for work, keeps us having families, keeps us having children. If you drive through Grassy Lake, for instance, now, and you see all those Mennonite children running around and playing on the streets, there's a lot of energy in that community, and most of those are Low German Mennonites. It keeps us starting churches and schools and businesses. Spiritual hope has always been also part of most of our migrations. These migrations almost always are about faith and worship and raising families who know about God and communities where people consider God as the center of our lives. So our search for a place is very much connected to our hope in God as the anchor of everything and the freedom to live out our faith as we wanted to live it out. So who is this God whom we follow and search for? Philip Martin is a pastor of a Lutheran church in the United States, and he preached a sermon recently which he entitled Teeth and Bones. He talks about the resurrected Jesus being real to his followers, and while we sometimes talk about being the hands and feet of Christ, and we write songs about that, which we really are, he talks about being witnesses. It's a brief sermon, but he talks about Jesus meeting the disciples after he is risen. None of them are really convinced yet that he is real, because they saw him die. He was buried. They had been so hopeful, and now they were in fear, wondering if it was all just maybe not quite true. They needed, as Philip Martin says, teeth and bones and skin to know this experience of resurrection, the experience of God among them, real and live and touchable. And to them, Jesus said, "Here I am. You can touch me." He did not press them to believe, nor did he belittle their unbelief. We all doubt. They were doubting. So Jesus talked to them about all that they had seen, and he said, "You are witnesses to all this." And that, says Philip Martin, is our work as followers of Christ. We are witnesses, and because of that, we become the hands, the teeth, the bones, the touchable Christ that every one of our neighbors has a right to know, just like the disciples doubted and then knew back then. Pastor Martin says the principal task of our faith and our life together is first and foremost to be witnesses, to say we have seen and heard these things and have experienced the Lord's grace. And that experience of God's grace, what we have seen and what we have felt in ourselves and seen in our friends and neighbors, is our primary hope, a hope that we are witnesses to. Because just as the disciples needed an authentic Jesus that day, one with bones and teeth and flesh and skin, to help them move from being afraid to joy and hope, the world is in need of an authentic witness to the Christ, one that takes up space in the world, one that has a backbone and stands with the many who are saying with the psalmist, "Oh, that we might see some good." Our call is to not just be people who gather once a week to think good thoughts about God. Rather, it is to be a community of people whose presence and activity puts flesh and bones to the presence of Christ in the world. And when we do that, we bring hope to those around us, and we become the Christ to them. This may have something to do with speaking the word to each other, but it has far more to do with how we behave with each other. Remember Acts chapter 2, the end of the chapter? How they behaved with each other is what attracted so many people to them. This is what people see, and that behavior either gives them hope or it crushes their hope. It's Jesus, the Christ, coming right into our ordinary lives. In Mark, as I read earlier, Jesus is tired, tries to get away, gets in a boat. The people guess where he is landing, and they are there ahead of him, and he has compassion on them and feeds them. His compassion moves him to action. He is interruptible. Later in the chapter, again in a boat, the people recognize him, and he again has compassion, and he heals them. He doesn't push them away. He's not too busy or too tired. C.S. Lewis, some of you have read his books, once said, the most distinguishing mark of a Christian is the person who is interruptible. And that's all of us. When somebody needs something nearby, are we interruptible? And this is the promise, the God person now in human flesh with human emotions, meeting the people where they were. That was Jesus in Mark, with all their needs. Their lives are mostly difficult, close to the edge, often in despair, and this Jesus makes them hopeful. That kind of hope, when we show up for each other right in the middle of our troubled and our overly busy world, is what we are called to. Jesus is God in the flesh, and we are his witnesses. Years ago, I was in Uganda when I was with MCC, and we went to a school, a Christian school, and there were 300 students there, and MCC sponsored about 26 of those. It wasn't very many. So we had some connection to that school, and so we were invited there to meet some of the students, and then they invited us, the staff. They said, stay for lunch, and so we did. We sat around in a circle, and during the course of that lunch, one of the people in our group asked the head master, the woman who was the principal of the school, says, so what is it about the Mennonites that you like? It was a bit of a self-serving question, I thought, but it was asked. But I was surprised at the comment. She had almost nothing to say about it. She just said this one thing. We like the Mennonites because you show up. And that's really our message as Christians to the world around us. We want to show up for each other, as they did in Acts chapter 2, as we try to do all over the world, as we try to do here with each other, because that's when people meet this Jesus who has skin and bones and teeth. Thank you very much for having us in Picture Butte. Very glad to be here, and blessings in the rest of your day. Amen.
Would you rise and sing with us one more song, please?